What is up guys, Alex from Lakey Wargames here and welcome to today's Age of Sigmar hobby discussion. Today we're going to be taking a look at the future of Orruk Warclans, and in doing so we're going to look at where they've come from, where they're currently at, and where they might end up in the future as a model range and faction. Alrighty guys, so welcome to today's topic where we are going to be discussing the future of Orruk Warclans. Now before we get too far into actually looking at the future of Orruk Warclans, we need to take a little bit of a look at what actually is Orruk Warclans and how have we got to the conclusion that I have gotten to. So first up, let's have a little look at what our Orruk Warclans are, and they are three different factions from across different times of sort of Age of Sigmar that have all been squished together into one battle tome for 3rd edition. Your Orruk Warclans are made up of your Ironjaws, who were part of the old world in Age of Sigmar when it first came around, with some new kits made to go with to make a sort of combined faction of the two and push them forward. We have our Cruel Boys, which were brand new to Age of Sigmar for 3.0. They were in our Dominion launch box and are in all of the current starter sets, and are kind of the new boys on the block with a bunch of new fantastic looking models and lore to go to boot, purely for Age of Sigmar. And then we also have our Bone Splitters, which are the savage orcs from the world that was, and their model range I still believe is currently all but one Underworld's warband, is just everything ported straight from the old world and hasn't been updated sadly in all the time that is. And they are the three factions that make up the Orruk Warclans. So we have one that was sort of a little bit of both, one that's completely Age of Sigmar and one that is completely old world. There's also the Big War, which is a part of the discussion. Isn't actually a faction outright in itself, but it's just a form of playing with a mixture of all three of these factions together. So I personally think that the sort of future of Orruk Warclans is that the Bone Splitters are going to be disappearing and going back to the old world, which is going to be the new game that Games Workshop will be dropping, sort of almost a reboot of Warhammer Fantasy with a few twists to it. And the Ironjaws and Cruel Boys will be getting split back into separate battle tomes. So Ironjaws used to have one, Cruel Boys not so much, but Ironjaws and Cruel Boys will get separate books in 4th edition when the Warclans are eventually redesigned, and I think it'll be like one of those releases where they come out together, and that we'll see some newer units to be able to put those factions into their separate books. So let's have a little breakdown of why I think that this is going to be what's going to be happening. And the main problem has always been for Ironjaws, for the longest time, that their faction selection was always a really small pool of units to choose from. Now, they just recently got a new wave of awesome models. I've put some up on the screen for you to be able to see, in the recent Dawnbringers campaign books, where they now have so many extra units added. It pretty much doubled their range. We've got all of the new brute models, we've got some new hero models, we've got Big Pig, we got the hero version and the non-hero version, so there's a whole sort of extra layer of units now bolted onto Ironjaws, which would make them as a standalone faction much stronger. We've seen this a few times in Age of Sigmar with things like Flesh Eater Courts, where small factions have been around for a long time. Obviously we've just seen over the weekend just gone that Flesh Eater Courts are getting a complete sort of redesign, whole bunch of extra added units, and this is kind of what Ironjaws just got in a few updates ago, and that would make them a lot stronger to stand on their own 2 feet. Cruel Boys themselves already have a fairly strong pool of units to choose from. Their models look absolutely fantastic. They've got this sort of all the Age of Sigmar love, almost like when NIGHTHAUNT were first released. They got obviously all of the great looking toys. None of those sort of static old fantasy poses from the old rank and flank. So they've got a nice fluid looking line, and well, they're only a few units off pretty much having a range with a little bit of everything. All that they'd need is maybe some form of cavalry and maybe a big unmounted monster, and to be honest then you've got pretty much everything to go with that line. And the last reason that I think that this will be the case is because Bone Splitters just haven't seen any real love apart from that single Underworlds unit within almost 8 to 9 years of Age of Sigmar. and that's a really long time to go without any real updates. Again, using Flesh Eater Quartz as an example, they also didn't really get too much apart from that spike in 2019 where their battle tome was broken and everyone hated them, unless you were playing them, of course. But yeah, Bone Splitters just don't really see any proper support or love or separate battle tome support where, you know, Flesh Eater Quartz on the model side of things might have been unsupported, but they've always had that standalone sort of faction tome ever since we broke apart the old soup of undead in the Legions of Nagash book, and they sort of became their own thing, and they've been standalone ever since. But Bone Splitters just don't see that sort of level of support. This leads me to thinking, are Bone Splitters already being replaced under our eyes without us even noticing? We see now that with these new Ironjaws and Cruel Boys units, there's a lot more shirtless, bone-covered, War energy-driven units, like the Monster Killer Warband for Cruel Boys that we've just seen. A bunch of shirtless guys with skulls on their heads and things. The Brute Ragers for the Ironjaws. You know, Ironjaws are normally these big armoured-clad sort of monstrosity versions of the Orruks. And the Brute Ragers are now sort of these shirtless, big, crazy guys. So that's kind of taking the rug out from under Bone Splitters. Unless they get a complete overhaul and redesign, that's kind of their unique thing, is being the shirtless guys running around in their underwear with lots of bones. That's why they're the Bone Splitters. Hunting monsters and just, you know, doing all that kind of craziness, where the Ironjaws were the big armoured sort of crazy ones and the Cruel Boys are the sneaky swamp dwellers. And yeah, now that they're sort of bleeding into that thematic look and feel, it might be a case that these units are slowly seeping in. So when Bone Splitters have gone away, they haven't been completely replaced in the sense of there are still some kits out there that are very similar to that sort of look aesthetic. The only thing that Bone Splitters currently have that the others don't is they boast the Boar Boys, which, although we have the, you know, Gore Grunters, or the Pigs as people call them for Ironjaws, Boar Boys are sort of that middle ground unit of not being a bigger elite cavalry type. They're just your sort of standard 5 guys. But if Cruel Boys were to get some form of cavalry which would really round out their unit roster, like Hobgrot Riders for light cavalry, and then maybe some smaller sort of Swamp Beast cavalry for a more elite version, then surely all the bases are covered, and that would completely remove all of the unique look and feel to Bone Splitters. One of the other things that I think is really interesting to look at is the Gork and Mork aspect of the Orruk Warclans sort of system. In their lore, they have their gods of Gork and Mork, with Gork being the more fighting, upfront and brutal, which is basically Ironjaws all over, and Mork is more of the sneaky, backstabbing and cunning version of their god, which is Cruel Boys all over. So where does that leave Bone Splitters? They kind of sit in this no man's land, middle ground version, but GW could just lean into either of these concepts so much better with either of the other two, because they literally are just the epitome of Gork and Mork. So again, without that sort of overhaul redesign, do they really need a sort of middle ground sitting faction? And it's just one of those, it's like there is potential for that to be there, but it really depends how they go about it. So even from that sort of sense, it feels like there's these two sides of the coin for the Orruk Warclans, and that Ironjaws and Cruel Boys just sit into either side of those coins, covering the bases, and would leave the Bone Splitters out to dry. Now, even when we look at the start collecting or newly branded Vanguard sets, the Orruk Warclans Vanguard set is a rather poor way to put it, in my opinion. It used to be the Ironjaws start collecting set, and now they got a revamped Vanguard set. It's just purely Cruel Boys. So it's not really Orruk Warclans, because surely that would have a little bit of everything in there. And yeah, it's basically now a Cruel Boys start collecting or Vanguard set, and it would be so easy for Games Workshop to put together an Ironjaws Vanguard set and just rename the current Orruk Warclans one to Cruel Boys Vanguard, and then boom, there you have it. You have your two Orruk factions that are left, the two that have a tome. They both have their own Vanguard set, and I just really don't see Games Workshop doing that for the Bone Splitters, or having three different sort of Orc Vanguard sets, whereas if you just had two of the very different belief systems and different playstyle versions of the Urruks, and they could very easily just bring back the old sort of start collecting or change a few of the units out for the Ironjaws, and then the Kruleboyz one would just need a little bit of a name change from Orruk Warclans to Kruleboyz, and then they are good to go. So what about Big War? What will happen to that sub-faction? At the moment it's currently a very popular sub-faction that allows you to pull units from sort of all three, so your Ironjaws, Kruleboyz and Bone Splitters, and use them all together. And my point to that would be, if the two bigger factions were fleshed out properly and they have all their own proper sub-factions, extra units put in, and the rules are all balanced properly, then instead of making them one-trick ponies, then it's just kind of, do you even need the Big War? Sure, it's a lot of fun to play and mix and sort of have your Ironjaw stuff up front and then your Kruleboyz shooters behind, but then it sort of takes the flavour out of the faction, in my opinion. I know a lot of people would personally kind of like being able to do that sort of combined mixed arms faction, but yeah, I don't know. Like I said, if you were to balance and flesh out the other two themselves so they could have their own way of doing that without combining the Big War, we see that Games Workshop is pulling away from what we call these soup armies, which is having lots of mini factions put together. You look at the latest cities of Sigmar and the coalitions and things all kind of getting squashed out of the game. It feels like a real squeeze, and that Games Workshop is trying to keep this trend up of just not having this around anymore. And I think that the 3.0 Orruk Warclans book of squeezing all these three factions together was kind of a last minute save decision, we could say, to just keep these three together and put them all into one book instead of having to write out and have release schedules for all three of these different tomes. It was just easier for them to take all the war scrolls, lump them together, make a few little changes and add in the Big War. But it just doesn't seem to be on the current trend of what we see. And like I said, if it was all balanced out properly, Big War at the moment is popular with the more competitive edge players, purely because they get to cherry pick the best units. But again, we don't see this for any other faction, and you can always use the conventional allies system to be able to take units from sort of Ironjaws, Kruleboyz and put them into the other individual faction of your choice. And although the ally system isn't perfect for doing that in that regard, that's a whole nother topic for another day. Is that, if you think allies need redesigning or tweaking in some way, which I personally do, I think it's okay with what we have, but there is probably a better way to do it. Do I know what that is off the top of my head? No, but if we sat down and thought about it, then maybe. But again, that's a whole other topic for another day, but you could still ally some units across. So this last 10 minutes or so we've been talking about reasons for Bone Splitters to go and why Games Workshop will maybe, more chance than not, go down that road. But is there any real hope for the Bone Splitters to stay? And like I said, it could be argued that Bone Splitters provide that middle ground for the Orc culture. So where the Ironjaws are Gork and Kruleboyz are sort of Mork, Bone Splitters do bring that balance to the table, and you kind of have that Gork and Morker balance point there. So again, Games Workshop could play with that and do something, or maybe with the current lore, the Bone Splitters will be able to pull sort of the best of both, and maybe they'll conjure up some sort of third Uruk god, or maybe almost like a Mortark level of sort of Orc would rise up and make this sort of third middle ground. Would it be outright Bone Splitters, or would it be something completely redesigned into sort of AOS kind of fantasy elements, instead of kind of leaning on that sort of old world look and feel? But I think that is a fair possibility. It's also fair to say that in the current lore, Bone Splitters do keep up. They pop up in the stories. Whenever you hear Orruk Warclans, Bone Splitters are always sort of hovering around in the background, and they are there. And Games Workshop have kept up with the rebranding with the rest of the Uruks, so that they get in the flashy new boxes with the red trims on them and things like that. So there is also that, like, they haven't been completely left like some of the old kits that we've seen over the years, or they disappear to sort of mail order only, so Games Workshop don't have to bother with the boxes at all. They just chuck them in those generic white boxes, where they don't sell them at all, but they are. If you go into a Warhammer store, Games Workshop store, you do see the Bone Splitters there packaged correctly and kept up with the modern times. So again, that could just be a completely marketing thing of, they want it all to look a certain way, so they rebrand everything regardless of what they're planning on doing with it. But yeah, why spend all that money on it and then just throw it away? But that is also a very Games Workshop thing to do, as we've seen over the course of many years. So yeah, one must never say never. That could lean either way, but being in the lore and being in the current branding of style is always a plus, I would say. And also, I hope for them to stay is, I do think there are a lot of players out there that still really like them. The play rate isn't very high, but then that's also due to the lack of support. It's kind of like the argument with Lord of the Rings, where a lot of people don't play Middle-earth strategy battle game. It's not sort of shouting from the rooftops popular. If you dive into it, there are a lot of people who really like it, and it does have its own sort of subculture thing going on, and if you're in that pool of interest, then you'll know a lot more about it and obviously see all the people that do like it. But from a surface level, they're just not a very popular faction. But again, that's probably, if Games Workshop were to bring out the support, bring out some big guns, breathe some life into Bone Splitters and sort of redesign them, pull them up, some new models, new book, new styles to them, then I think we could see a fair amount of people sort of reappear, or for the first time think, oh, these new guys look really cool, I'm going to have a look into them, and you'll see a lot more players sort of appear and be able to pick up that mantle of playing the Bone Splitters. So after all that, where does that leave us? Well, for me personally, I echo still what I believe at the start. I think Ironjaws and Kruleboyz will stay and Bone Splitters will be leaving us. I think we got the new Ardboys for this reason. The old Ardboys kit is probably going to go back to Old World and become the Black Orcs like they used to be from the sort of fantasy setting. Bone Splitters will be doing the same sort of thing because they were the savage orcs from the world that was. So I think that Bone Splitters will disappear, the savage orcs will reappear in the Old World, so the kits won't be gone per se, but they'll just be removed from the sort of Age of Sigmar line. Obviously returning alongside the classic orc and goblins that all got legended at the period between sort of Age of Sigmar 1st and 2nd edition. We saw all that stuff going away, and I think Ironjaws and Kruleboyz will be getting more love filling out for the Grand Alliance of Destruction with a little more than they currently do and be in their own books. But even again, after saying all this, I might be wrong. Maybe we see Bone Splitters get some major love in the future and they'll get the Flesh Eater Courts treatment, and it would have just taken a long time to get there. Whether that means that they will all stay into one book under Orruk Warclans and they get that sort of treatment, they might stay as they are for a period of time and then when 4th edition comes round, it might just be Ironjaws stay as they are, Kruleboyz stay as they are, Bone Splitters get the reflesh, and then they're all still under that one book. Or maybe Games Workshop will be really, really brave, and it would be a lot of work, but would split all of the Orruk Warclans back out into 3 separate battle tomes, and we still see Bone Splitters. Again, I'm on the personal opinion of I think we'll just see Ironjaws and Kruleboyz with Bone Splitters leaving us, but that doesn't mean that I am right. But I would love to hear what you guys think. What do you think will happen with the future of Orruk Warclans? Do you play Bone Splitters yourself? Do you play sort of a mix of everything in this book? Or do you prefer just sticking to one of the sort of 3 factions? Would you be happy to see them all go their separate ways so they all stay but are in separate tomes? Or do you like having them all under one banner? Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts and feelings on this topic and what you see the future of Orruk Warclans being. Also, if you'd like to continue the discussion, you can join the Lakey Wargames Discord. Link will be in the description below, where we talk all things from sort of hobby to army tactics and faction discussions, and just all-round hobby goodness all the time. But until then, thank you very much for watching, guys. Stay safe and happy wargaming.